Welcome back to the Made for This group study on the book of Daniel. Last week, we looked at the context and how Daniel was now in Babylon. He had left his home in Judah and was here now as in exile. And we're going to dive in today into chapter 1 and see this very first decision that Daniel makes. But first, we learn that he is in Babylon and he is being immersed into the culture. He's being immersed into the religion. He's learning the language and all about the philosophies and way of thought of the Babylonian culture. And even it tells us that he and his friends all received name changes. And these are really interesting name changes because they all initially have names that signify their God, the God of Israel, and then their names are changed to signify the pagan gods of Babylon. So this seems like really significant. However, in the text, you can't read it to seem that these name changes are demeaning or humiliating to them. It's just a natural reaction to now them being in a new place. But then all of a sudden we see Daniel, what kind of seems like him and his friends almost kind of seem like pawns as they're being assimilated into this culture. We see him in chapter 1, verse 8, show some agency and show his leadership, and he makes a decision. And so I'm going to read to you now chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." And so here we see Daniel, he's making a choice that he is not going to partake of this food. And so why is the food all of a sudden now something that he is choosing not to partake in? Why is this something that he thinks, oh, this is too far, this is crossing some sort of line? And all throughout the whole book of Daniel, not in this chapter, we're going to see that one of the questions that continues to come up is, when you are faithful to the kingdom of God, how then do you navigate a culture that is going in a direction that is completely opposite? This is something that we'll see Daniel navigate well. And today what we're going to see in that question is, why the food? Why is he choosing to abstain from the food? And some historians will say it's because the food definitely would not be following the dietary laws of the Jewish people, and so that's why he wanted to abstain from it. Or there were different scholars that think that any of the food that was offered at the king's table would have been offered as a sacrifice to the pagan gods first, even partaking in the food an act of idolatry worship, which is maybe why Daniel didn't want to partake in it. But I don't think we can get lost in this question of why the particular food. The question isn't why the food, why did he draw a line here? The takeaway from the story of Daniel is that he drew a line at all. Is that there was a line he knew that needed to be drawn. You see, these boys had been immersed into Babylonian culture. They were being assimilated in so many different ways. And this was a space and a decision that Daniel knew that he needed to make in order to reorient himself daily with the one true God. You think about a meal. Think about how often he would be having to sit down and eat the meals. 3 times a day, he was going to be putting himself in a posture and a position where he was going to reorient himself as a son of the one true God, as a son of the God of Israel. And even though he's here in Babylon and everything is different, maybe he feels uncomfortable and he's learning all about these new religions and these different gods and this different language, this was going to be a time where he always committed himself to be reminded of whose he was and who he was. So the question isn't, why did he draw the line here at the food? Let's look at how he drew this line. I think that's a really fascinating thing to see in the character of Daniel. And when you notice, when I read the text, it says that Daniel resolved that he would not be defiled himself and was not going to eat the king's food. In the King James Version, it actually says he purposed in his heart that he was not going to eat the food. You see, it doesn't say that he sat down and after 3 or 4 days of eating this food, did he then decide, you know what, this wasn't a good idea. He didn't even start having the meal. In the middle of the meal, did he decide, oh, you know what, I probably shouldn't eat this. It's very clear that this was a decision he had made before he even started the meal. And so this is such a beautiful thing that we can learn about Daniel, is that he's kind of setting up these guardrails. He's enacting the convictions that he has based on his past experiences. And he's going to not even put himself in this position of temptation. He is going to make his decision and stand firm in it before he is even engaged with it. It reminds me of my younger brother. He's 5 years younger than I am. And I went to Texas A&M, and then 5 years later, he also went to Texas A&M. And so before his freshman year started, we sat down and I wanted to have a conversation with him and just to prepare him. He had just gotten back from the A&M fish camp and was about to head off. And I know in his mind, he was thinking, oh, this is going to be such a fun conversation. She's going to tell me all the cool ins and outs of, College Station, what he can be expecting about life as an Aggie. But I sat down with him and as a older sister / maybe potential maternal figure, I just really prepared him for all the different situations he potentially could find himself in here in college, living away from our parents, living with a bunch of 18-year-old boys and not having the accountability of your community and your family. And so I walked through so many different scenarios. I walked through so many different what-if situations where I really wanted him to think through and process, because when we have convictions, it's important to be reminded of those and to live by those and be guided by those, because if you haven't made a decision before you enter the situation, you're very likely to fall into that temptation. And so I wanted to have a conversation with him and walk through on a really realistic level of what the different areas were where he could be tempted, places where he could not live out how Christ would want him to live. And so this conversation, it was thoughtful. It was really hard to have, but it was really important, because if you think about it, a lot of times in culture, this is absolutely where it becomes so easy for us to start compromising what the Lord would have for us. The world makes it so easy for us to kind of think things are okay, think things that are not of the Lord, to think that they're okay and they're fine. And sometimes this can even happen in our own Christian communities. And that's actually where it even can get more confusing sometimes, when people of the Lord who start making choices that don't look like ones of people who are dependent and loyal to the kingdom of God, but more like those who are following after the kingdoms of this world. And so it's important to have those conversations and to be mindful. And that's what we see Daniel doing here, is he had purposed in his heart. He had made the choice before mealtime even happened that this was going to be a place and a time that he would be reminded of who he was as a son of God, and that he wasn't going to give into the temptation to become more and more like people in the Babylonian Empire. This is exactly what the Babylonians wanted, is that they wanted them to be fully immersed into their world. They wanted them to forget about the one true God of the people of Israel. They wanted them to forget about their laws and the way that they did living, and their Sabbath and their dietary restrictions, and to forget about their holidays and festivals, and to forget about the ways in life that they had in Judah. They wanted them to be fully immersed here. And Daniel wasn't going to do that. He had made that choice to live out his convictions in Babylon. And what's really neat to watch too is how Daniel did this. He doesn't yell at the top of his lungs. He doesn't jump on the dinner table and say, I'm not eating this. He goes privately to the eunuch with all respect and with graciousness and says, I'm not going to eat this food. And they have a conversation and walk through it. And I think this is something also that Christians can really learn a lot from Daniel, is how we draw a line. When we do choose to not join in sin or to join in something that the world sees is okay, a lot of times we like to then make a Facebook post about how terrible it is and why we're not going to do it, or we're going to stand at the street corner and we're going to yell, and sometimes our voice is so loud about how much we think about how much and why we're not doing something that we think is wrong, and it drowns out the good news and the love of Jesus Christ. Sometimes we can be so loud about what we are against that we forget to tell the message of what we are for, and that is for God's kingdom and to be transformed by the love that He has for us. And all of our stories are different of when we came to know God and when He intersected our life. But as believers, we have now been formed by the love that He has for us, and then that is lived out in the convictions that we have. If we don't believe it, then it is not seen in our lifestyle. But once we believe it and we are transformed by it, then it is manifested in our life as convictions and choices that we make. So I'm hopeful and prayerful that your conversation today, looking at the story of Daniel, is one of encouraging and challenging to remind us that we are made for this because the convictions that we can have based on who we follow.